Hey, good evening, scholars. Hope everyone's well. It is evening right now, 8:48. We are on our last topic. It's the very last one. So no one could leave class because of music lessons, and no one can leave class because of y'all, and no one can leave class because of FFA trips or anything like that. This is the last one, and after this, we'll be starting to review. All right, what we're going to be talking about tonight is the Phillips curve. So take your hands off your faces. All right, and no, let's pay attention. Let's not talk about anything and focus in. Generally speaking, the Phillips curve and Phillips' idea of the relationship between inflation and unemployment is on usually one of the part twos, the smaller of the part twos. The idea is if we go back to the law of supply, the higher the price, what's the answer? The higher the quantity supplied. And the lower the price, the lower the quantity supplied. Just like when we talk about inflation, inflation causes a rise in prices. So theoretically, if there's a higher price because of inflation, suppliers would want to supply more. And if they supplied more, that would mean they'd require how many workers? More workers. So if they required more workers, unemployment would go, that's right, down. And aggregate demand would move outward. And the GDP would rise. And the economy would be in a period of expansion. So we know that fiscal policy is the idea of using taxes and spending by the president and Congress to cause fiscal economic stability. All right? But monetarism is changing the money supply. All right, adjusting the money supply using the monetary tools. What are those three tools? One of them is the RRR, Reserve Requirement Ratio. The other one is the discount rate. And last but not least is open market operation or bond sales. That's done by the Federal Reserve. That's independent. But in late 1958, Phillips, who was a British economist, believed that if the government could essentially cause higher inflation by increasing demand, as we see in this right-hand graph, if the government could increase aggregate demand by using more by lowering taxes and creating more spending, getting people to spend more and businesses to spend more and government to spend more, the price level would rise. And if the price level rose, it would cause lower unemployment. All right, because with higher inflation, the prices are higher. Essentially, with the prices that are higher, employers will want to employ more. And if they employ more, aggregate demand will move out. And the economy could be at full employment. All right, 4 to 6% unemployment. And that was the theory that Phillips had. Okay. So if we look at a Phillips curve, all right, the curve on the y-axis has inflation. On the x-axis, is unemployment. The relationship is inverse or negative. The higher the rate of inflation, the lower the rate of unemployment, as we see. And the lower the rate of inflation, the higher the rate of unemployment. Please try to remember, Phillips was wrong. He was wrong. His idea caused crowding out and caused stagflation. The idea that essentially the government would overspend and borrow and borrow and borrow, driving interest rates up. And if interest rates went up, people would borrow less. And if businesses and people borrowed less, aggregate demand would actually go inward, but prices would remain high. And therefore fiscal policy couldn't work. It became the argument for people like Milton Friedman, which is our keyword of the day, Milton Friedman, for this video, okay, and for Module 34's assignment. The keyword, once again, is Milton Friedman. Okay, what it actually did was, for Milton Friedman, it created the idea of monetarism. We're using macroeconomic stabilization through the adjustment of the money supply, not using fiscal policy. But Phillips made the argument in 58 that more or less that if you had high rates of inflation, that were artificially created by government overspending, by expansionary fiscal policy, you could keep unemployment permanently low. All right? So in the short-run Phillips curve, this is a short-run Phillips curve, we see relationship between inflation and unemployment. Are your hands off your faces? Okay. So we see relationship here between inflation and unemployment. All right? And that's the idea. It's a negative or an inverse relationship. What causes the Phillips curve to shift or move up or down is supply shocks, either positive supply shocks or negative supply shocks. If it's a positive supply shock, and I have the textbook over here just to double check because it gets a little confusing here. But with a positive supply shock, what would happen is the cost of doing business would go down and the Phillips curve would shift down. And with a negative supply shock, for example, OPEC decides to cease production and oil prices skyrocket, that would result in the Phillips curve going up. Okay, I know we're supposed to say in and out, but now we're doing up and down for the Phillips curve because the relationship is between inflation and unemployment. So the Phillips curve does shift, all right? It shifts upward and downward depending on supply shocks, okay? If a supply shock could be, a negative supply shock could be, like we said, OPEC cutting off the oil. A positive supply shock could be discovery of new oil and new raw materials, somewhat similar to the production possibilities curve. In the long run, though, the long run Phillips curve is a completely vertical line, all right, just like you see here. A vertical line showing the relationship between inflation and unemployment, all right? And it's just the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And why is it vertical? Because it's very similar to the long run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, after you have short run adjustments, you have an average or a mean that is essentially is represented by a vertical line. It's similar to the production possibilities frontier when we talk about microeconomics, where you have that concave shape. Yeah, that's concave. Convex would be inward. All right, so you have that concave shape. So therefore, what it's showing is over time, once all inflation is adjusted for, the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And that's what they call the NAIRU, or the non-accelerated inflation rate of unemployment. It's similar to just essentially the full employment, or long-run aggregate supply. So a lot of times they ask you to shift a Phillips curve. They ask you to draw a Phillips curve, show the relationship. They give you some kind of shock or supply shock or something that happens, they ask you to shift, and then they ask you to draw a long-run Phillips curve. The truth is, though, that when we look at the actual data, and here's the data of unemployment and inflation through the 90s, from the 60s all the way to the 90s, you could see that it's scattered everywhere. For example, when Reagan became president in 1980, inflation was 13%, and unemployment was at 7%, which isn't good. It's out of the range. And then 82, unemployment went to 10%, and 83, inflation started to go down, and unemployment was still high. We could also see points where unemployment, inflation was low, like in 86 and 92, and unemployment was still not desirable at 7, 8, 10%. So it showed that the data really showed that Phillips isn't correct. Now you're going to ask, what are you going to ask? Of course, why do we show the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve is really the rationale for monetarism. But of course, you're in the advanced placement course. And the advanced placement course wants to make sure that everything is taught. And therefore, they test you to make sure that you've been taught everything. And that's why we see the Phillips curve a lot of times on the AP exam. You're not going to see Unit 6, so we really don't have to go much farther we don't have to go farther at all into the textbook. And that's why we're not. And for Unit 1 of macroeconomics, if you are doing the reviews, it's all microeconomics. You won't see microeconomics on the macro test. But the first unit of macroeconomics is teaching micro, because some schools only do macro or micro. Very few schools, except here in Cobleskill, where we're WD strong, okay, we do both. All right, so this way you can earn up to 6 college credits. So that's why we do both, and that's why we teach. That's why we just skip through Unit 1 when we go to macro, because we already learned microeconomics. No reason to continue to do that. So the reason why the Phillips curve is wrong is simply because the idea is if prices go up, I'm going to want to make more money because I need to afford those new goods. So therefore, I'm going to need to be paid more. So if I start to get paid more, you're going to want to hire less of me. So therefore, that eventually will cause unemployment. It's called the wage price spiral. As prices go higher, people are going to want higher wages. As they want higher wages, the cost of labor goes up. And if the cost of labor goes up, eventually supply shifts inward. When supply shifts inward, prices go up, but unemployment goes up. And therefore, both of those are going up. That's essentially stagflation. So that's why the Phillips curve doesn't really work. Okay? And therefore, what we'd see here is you see the upward shift here because of a positive supply shock. And that positive supply shock could be something like something that drives the inflation rate up. Could be the wage price spiral or something to that effect. Okay? So that's what we see with Phillips curve. Once again, in the short run, the Phillips curve is this curved line. You can just draw a diagonal line. It doesn't matter. It could be diagonal, it could be curved, whatever works for you. But on the y-axis is inflation. On the x-axis is unemployment rate. High inflation, according to Phillips, not reality, would cause lower unemployment. And low inflation would actually cause high unemployment. Remember, the idea is in a depression, you actually have deflation. In economic depression, you have deflation. The worst thing for an economy is when prices go down. Because if prices go down, employers will employ less because they're selling less and making less money. And then unemployment goes up and people have less money, so they spend less. So prices continue to go down and the economy becomes depressed. Okay? And that was the Great Depression. So deflation is really one of the worst things you can have for an economy. And if we look over here, we see the reflection here of unemployment and inflation. Okay? The unemployment line is the blue line, and inflation is the orange line. And you could see when inflation rises, eventually unemployment rises, or inflation rises, unemployment rises. And you see here's it over during the beginning of the Reagan years. Reagan came into the presidency saddled with very high inflation. Eventually, the Federal Reserve chairperson at that time was able to start using monetary tools to get inflation down and cut it down. I think it was, I forgot his name, pardon me. It'll come to me another time. But we see here that there is a relationship here that when we have also deflation or low prices, we start to see high. But Phillips wasn't really correct. We see high inflation, high unemployment. And that's the idea. He's wrong, but we still need to learn him. He's still on the AP exam, and he's the rationale for monetarism. And pretty much the main reason why, since the mid-1980s, the United States has really not had problems with inflation whatsoever. We've been able to keep price stability, which is one of the major goals of our economy. Hope everyone's well. We'll be starting to review soon, and we'll be maybe meeting a little bit more or not, or we'll see what we need. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions. If you don't understand something, give me a couple times to contact you or when we can get together. Generally, I'm online from 10 to 11 in the morning. If you need anything, just let me know. Otherwise, be well, and we'll see you soon. Take care.